In 1985, Steve Jobs got forced out of Apple.
What can I say? I hired the wrong guy.
That was Scully?
Yeah, he destroyed everything I'd spent 10 years working for.
Apple, the company he co-founded at 21, the company that made him worth over $200 million by the time he was 25. And most of the people who worked with him thought Apple made the right call. Almost nobody remembers that part. So today we're talking about how a college dropout built the defining company of his generation, how he lost it in a fight that he started himself, and why the worst days of his career might be the only reason you know his name. Now, let's set the stage a little bit. Steve Jobs was born in 1955 in San Francisco, California. His biological mother was a young, unmarried graduate student, and she put him up for adoption with one condition. Whoever took him had to promise to send him to college. The couple who adopted him, Paul and Clara Jobs, weren't wealthy. Paul was a machinist who never finished high school. But they made the promise and they kept it, and they raised him in the middle of what was about to become Silicon Valley. That neighborhood shaped him. The valley was filling up with engineers, and Paul Jobs gave his son a section of his own workbench and taught him to take things apart and see how they worked and put them back together. The kid grew up assuming you could build the things you saw around you, and the kid had nerve. At 12 years old, Jobs decided to build a piece of electronics called a frequency counter, but he was missing parts. So what he did was he opened the phone book and looked up Bill Hewlett, because back in those days, you could just do that. Open the phone book and find the CEO of a big company right there like anybody else. And that, by the way, that Hewlett is the Hewlett in Hewlett-Packard, or HP. Jobs actually called him at his house. Hewlett picked up, and a 12-year-old Jobs introduced himself and asked for spare parts. Hewlett laughed. Then he gave him the spare parts and a summer job at Hewlett-Packard that summer, building frequency counters on an assembly line. Jobs told that story on camera for the rest of his life, and the lesson he drew from it was simple. Most people never pick up the phone and ask. The ones who do are the ones who end up doing things instead of dreaming about them. In 1972, the college promise came due, and it nearly broke them. Jobs picked Reed College, one of the most expensive schools in the country, burned through most of his parents' savings, and dropped out after 6 months. But he didn't leave. He hung around campus for another year and a half, sleeping on friends' floors, returning Coke bottles for food money, and sitting in on whatever classes looked interesting. One of them was a calligraphy class. Typefaces, letter spacing, completely useless information for our college dropout in 1972. 10 years later, he poured all of that into the Macintosh, and it's a big part of why computers today have beautiful fonts at all. That's his own telling, by the way. He told that story to a stadium full of Stanford graduates in 2005, and his point was that you can't connect the dots looking forward, you can only connect them looking back. After Reed, Jobs went home and took a job as a technician at a young video game company called Atari, where he got moved to the night shift, partly because his coworkers complained that he didn't bathe. And he had one friend who mattered more than all the rest, a shy engineering genius 5 years older than him named Steve Wozniak. And it's right here, before Apple even exists, that we get the first version of a story that repeats for the rest of his life. In 1974, Atari offered Jobs a bonus if he could reduce the number of chips in a new game called Breakout. And Jobs wasn't a good enough engineer to do it, so he brought in Wozniak, who absolutely was, and they split the work. Woz did the engineering, Jobs handled the deal. And the way Wozniak tells it, Jobs told him the job paid $700 and paid him his half, $350. What Wozniak didn't know was that Atari had paid a bonus of about $5,000, and Jobs kept the difference. Wozniak says he didn't find out for about 10 years, and that when he finally read about it in a book, he cried. Not about the money, about the friend. Now, to be fair to the record, that's Wozniak's account. Jobs never really gave his own version of it publicly, but Woz has told the story the same way for decades, and he's the one who was there, so you decide. And also, remember this one because the pattern inside of it is gonna show up again and again. The vision and the charm and the deal making right next to a willingness to shade the truth with the people closest to him. Now, in 1975, a group of engineers and hobbyists started meeting in a garage in Menlo Park. They called it the Homebrew Computer Club. This was the moment computers were starting to shrink from machines that filled entire rooms into kits a hobbyist could build, and the club was where the obsessives traded parts, swapped designs, and showed off what they'd built. Wozniak was there for the first meeting, and the club is why the Apple One exists. Woz designed a complete personal computer on a single circuit board, not to sell, but to show off at Homebrew. That's what he did for fun. And in the spirit of the club, he did what the club did. He handed out photocopies of his design to anyone who wanted one for free. Jobs went to those meetings with him, and he saw something different. People didn't just admire Woz's design, they wanted the machine, and most of them couldn't build it from a schematic. So Jobs made the pitch that changed both their lives and, the rest of the world as well. Stop giving it away. Let's build the boards and sell them. So on April 1st, 1976, they founded Apple Computer. Jobs was 21, Woz was 25, and there was a third founder, a 41-year-old Atari colleague named Ron Wayne, who took 10% to be the adult in the room. To raise the starting money, Jobs sold his Volkswagen bus, and Woz sold his prized HP calculator. 12 days after founding Apple, Ron Wayne got nervous. As a partner, he was personally on the hook for Apple's debts, and unlike the two kids, he actually had some assets to lose. So he sold his 10% of Apple back to them for $800. That stake would eventually be worth hundreds of billions of dollars. And Wayne has said over and over that he doesn't regret it. Based on what he knew at the time, it was a rational decision. It's also, dollar for dollar, one of the most expensive rational decisions anybody has ever made. And a quick myth check while we're here, the garage. You've heard that Apple was born in the Jobs family garage. Wozniak himself has called this garage a bit of a myth. His words were that no design happened there, no prototyping happened there, no manufacturing happened there. The real work happened at his desk at Hewlett-Packard and in his apartment. The garage was mostly a place to feel like a company. What actually turned Apple into a company was a former Intel manager named Mike Markkula, who showed up in 1977, put in roughly $250,000, and gave two kids in their 20s adult supervision and a business plan. The money and that plan went into the Apple II. Woz engineered it, and it was his masterpiece. But Jobs' contribution was the part nobody in the hobby world was really thinking about. He insisted it be a finished product. A molded plastic case, a built-in keyboard, color graphics that plugged into the family TV. No soldering, no kits, no schematics. You took it home, you plugged it in, and it worked. They introduced it in April of 1977 at a computer fair in San Francisco, and it took off. Then in 1979, a small piece of software called VisiCalc came out. This was the first spreadsheet you could run on a personal computer, and at first it ran only on the Apple II. Suddenly, the Apple II wasn't a hobbyist toy, it was a business machine, and businesses bought it by the thousands. The Apple II carried the entire company for years. By 1980, Apple was doing over $100 million a year in revenue. In 1979, Jobs made a deal that people still argue about. Xerox, the copier giant, ran a research lab in Palo Alto called PARC, P-A-R-C, where they had invented pieces of the future and then mostly ignored them. In 1979, Xerox's venture arm wanted in on Apple before its IPO. The deal they cut was strange, but it was simple. Xerox got to buy about 100,000 pre-IPO shares at $10 a share. In exchange for letting them invest, Apple's engineers got inside PARC to see what Xerox was sitting on. And given the legend, the funny part is Jobs almost didn't go. By his own telling, 3 or 4 of his people had to keep bugging him to get over to PARC. So he finally did. The Apple team saw in that lab in December of 1979 changed everything. PARC showed them 3 things that day: a graphical interface, a computer you controlled with a mouse, windows on a screen, and graphics instead of green text. Then a new way of writing software called object-oriented programming. And then a networked office. More than 100 computers wired together, sending each other email. In 1979. Jobs said later in his own words that he was so blinded by the first one that he didn't even really see the other two. The man whose entire legend is seeing the future walked right past 2/3 of it. The networking he ignored became Ethernet, the technology that wired up the modern office. The software idea he ignored became the way almost all software gets built. Xerox handed him a look at 3 revolutions, and he only had eyes for one. Now, the standard version of the story is that Jobs robbed Xerox blind. He stole the future right off their lab benches. And I get why the story survives, because Jobs himself fed it. There's a famous clip of him from the 90s saying Apple has always been shameless about stealing great ideas and quoting Picasso. Good artists copy, great artists steal. But there's 2 problems with that legend. First, it wasn't theft. Xerox got paid in pre-IPO Apple stock in a deal they agreed to. And Apple didn't just photocopy what they saw. Xerox's mouse cost $300 and had 3 buttons. Apple engineered one that cost under $15 and had 1. Xerox's windows couldn't overlap. An Apple engineer named Bill Atkinson invented the way that windows layer on top of each other, partly because he'd seen the demo, misremembered it as better than it was, and then built the thing that he thought he saw. And the second, the Picasso quote. There's no solid evidence that Picasso ever said that. Quote researchers have traced the idea back to the poet T.S. Eliot instead. The most famous justification for stealing in tech history is itself probably stolen from the wrong guy. Xerox invented the future and didn't want it. Jobs paid for a look and bet his company on it. That's the actual story, and in my opinion, it's better than the heist. On December 12th, 1980, Apple went public in one of the biggest IPOs of its era. Steve Jobs was 25 years old, and on paper, he was suddenly worth over $200 million. And this is where this episode earns the word full story, because while all of that was happening, there was a little girl in Menlo Park living on welfare, and she was his daughter. In 1978, Jobs' on and off girlfriend since high school, Chris Ann Brennan, gave birth to a daughter named Lisa. Jobs denied he was the father. Brennan raised Lisa on welfare and cleaning houses while Jobs' company took off. The state of California eventually came after him for child support, and a court ordered a DNA test. The result put the probability of paternity at 94.1%. But Jobs kept fighting. In court filings, he swore he was sterile and infertile and physically incapable of fathering a child. He would go on to have 3 more children, by the way. And when Time magazine profiled him in 1983, he told them that 28% of the male population of the United States could be the father. He said that to a national magazine about his own daughter. He was eventually ordered to pay $385 a month plus pay back the state for the welfare. He settled the case and raised it to $500 a month right around the time Apple went public and made him one of the richest young men in America. And one detail tells you it was more complicated than just pure coldness. In 1978, the same year Lisa was born, Apple started work on a new computer, and Jobs named it the Lisa. The company line for years was that it stood for some engineering acronym, but decades later, he admitted to his biographer, Walter Isaacson, what everyone already knew. Obviously, he said it was named for his daughter. Now, years later, they reconciled. She took his last name, and she even lived with him as a teenager for a while. She also grew up and wrote a book about those years, and it is not a flattering book. The man building the future had a daughter on welfare and swore in court she couldn't be his. Both of those are the same person. The Lisa computer, the machine with his daughter's name on it, shipped in 1983 at $10,000, and it flopped. But then Jobs had already been pushed off the Lisa project by his own colleagues because he was impossible to work with. So he did something very Jobs. He walked down the hall, took over a small side project called Macintosh, and decided it would be the thing that mattered. The people who built the Mac under him described the same experience. He would demand things that were flatly impossible, refused to hear that they were impossible, and somehow the team would do them. In 1981, one of his engineers, Bud Tribble, gave this a name that stuck for the rest of Jobs' life. He borrowed it from Star Trek. In his presence, Tribble, which, by the way, funny that a guy named Tribble borrowed something from Star Trek. If you don't get that reference, then just pretend like you do. It's funny. But anyway, in his presence, Tribble said, reality is malleable. He can convince anyone of practically anything. And that's not a compliment, by the way, or an insult. It's the most accurate description anyone ever gave of the man. The reality distortion field built the Macintosh. It also swore in court that he was sterile. It's the same field. Now, the Macintosh launched in January of 1984, introduced by one of the most famous commercials ever made. And for a moment, it looked like the future had arrived. Sales exploded out of the gate, and then they stopped. The first Mac was beautiful, but it was underpowered, and it had almost no software. And by late 1984, the numbers were falling apart. Which brings us to the other man in this story. A year earlier, Jobs had recruited a new CEO for Apple, who had been the president of Pepsi, named John Sculley. He landed him with maybe the most famous recruiting pitch in business history. Do you want to sell sugar water for the rest of your life, or do you want to come with me and change the world? Sculley came to change the world. Within 2 years, the two of them would tear that company in half. By the spring of 1985, Apple had a crisis. Mac sales were collapsing, the company was heading for its first layoffs, and the Macintosh division was run by a co-founder who answered to no one and picked fights with everyone. Sculley decided Jobs had to be removed from running the Mac division. Not from Apple, from operations. Jobs decided Sculley had to go instead, and the legend gets this part wrong, so let's do it carefully. Jobs planned a boardroom coup. The idea was to move against Sculley over a holiday weekend while Sculley was scheduled to be on a business trip in China, but the plan leaked. Sculley canceled the trip, called the executive staff together, confronted Jobs directly in the room, and made everyone pick a side, and they picked Sculley. At the end of May 1985, the board stripped Steve Jobs of all operational responsibility at Apple. He kept the title of chairman and got an office that he called Siberia. He was 30 years old, he had co-founded the company, and he had nothing to do. And now another myth check, because you've heard this story as Steve Jobs got fired from Apple. That's not quite what happened. Nobody ever fired him. The board took away his power and left him a figurehead. He hung around for a few months, miserable, and in September, he resigned. In fact, his resignation letter specifically asked the company to make clear that leaving was his decision. Then he sold his Apple stock. All of it. All of it reportedly except a single share he kept, so they'd have to keep sending him the annual report. He took 5 Apple employees with him to start a new computer company, and Apple responded by threatening to sue him. 10 years after founding Apple, Steve Jobs was out, worth over $100 million, 30 years old, and according to most of Silicon Valley, finished. So let's step back and look at what actually happened here. Strip away the legend, and the art is simple. A kid adopted on a promise builds the defining company of his generation and gets forced out of it at 30. I keep coming back to one thing. Everything that made him great and everything that made him brutal came out of the same trait. He did not accept reality as delivered. Not the reality that computers had to be ugly. Not the reality that a demo he half remembered couldn't be built. And not, when it suited him, the reality of a DNA test. Most people get sanded down by 30. Jobs got sharpened. And the company that threw him out was right. They couldn't function with him inside it. But they were also about to spend a decade proving they couldn't function without him either. Because what happens next is the strangest part of this whole story. 10 years that everyone at the time called failure. The weird black computer that nobody bought, the cartoon studio that ate his fortune, and how those exact 10 years built everything that made the comeback possible. That's the next video, and it's on your screen right now.